name is Thorwald Franke, and in this video I want to talk about some widespread misconceptions and errors about Plato's Atlantis. And I want to explain what is correct instead. These misconceptions and errors concern both sides, Atlantis skeptics as well as Atlantis supporters. The most common misconception among Atlantis supporters is, without any doubt, an often missing differentiation between the original Atlantis on the one hand side, of which Plato talks as first and only known source, and some crazy ideas on the other hand side, which became connected to Atlantis in later times. It is clear that it is utter nonsense to consider Atlantis a wonder world of super technology, the origin of a super race, or the cradle of humankind, or as a place of mysticism and magic. This all has to be rejected because it has nothing to do with Plato's original Atlantis. Yet enough of that. Let us concentrate on the more interesting topics. A widespread misconception among Atlantis supporters is the idea that Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias are verbatim records of a real conversation. Yet this is wrong. It is important to understand that the dialogue settings described by Plato are fictitious. The described dialogue never happened in this form, especially not Plato's late dialogues. Plato wrote his dialogues as fictitious plays in order to demonstrate philosophical topics. Yet this does not mean, on the other hand, that all and everything in these dialogues is a fiction. This in turn is a misconception widespread among Atlantis skeptics. Plato was very serious about the contents of his dialogues, and Atlantis is such a content. Only because the dialogue setting is a fiction, this does not mean that Atlantis is a fiction. Another misconception, shared especially by Atlantis skeptics, concerns the question how the Atlantis story is presented by Plato. Some claim that Atlantis is presented as a myth or as an allegory, and therefore the interpretation as a fiction would be not in doubt. Yet this is wrong, plainly wrong. The Atlantis story is presented in Plato's dialogues as a true story. Of course, this does not mean that it is indeed a true story. But Atlantis skeptics cannot go the easy way here. By the way, let me say this for my English-speaking listeners. The widely used translation of Plato's dialogues by Benjamin Jowett contains, among others, the following mistake. Jowett translates logos with tale, which is wrong. Logos should be translated with a neutral word, such as story, in the context of the Atlantis dialogues. Otherwise, the translator forces his own interpretation onto the reader of his translation, which is not allowed for a good translator. So please do not think that Plato wrote of a, quote, tale. He did not. Similar is valid for irony as a literary device. Some claim it would be clearly recognizable that the statement that the Atlantis tradition is a true story is meant ironically. Yet this is questionable, because it is not easy to see that it is an invented story, if the Atlantis story is an invented story at all. You can maybe conclude the other way round, if you can prove by other arguments that it is an invention, then you can say that it is irony. but it is not at all allowed just to claim that it would be irony and then to conclude that it is an invented story. This is not allowed, really not. Many Atlantis skeptics, among them several academics, intentionally ignore a major turning point in the dialogue Timaeus. At the beginning of the Timaeus, there is indeed a plan to invent a story. Yet then comes the turning point. Then the dialogue participant Critias presents a true story instead. At least he claims it to be true. Socrates then says that a true story is better than an invented story. It is a big mistake to take the statements about an invented story from the beginning of the dialogue, so before the turning point of the dialogue, and to refer them to the Atlantis story after the turning point. You cannot do this. And Socrates is right. A true story is a much better evidence for a thesis than an invented story. And also the preference for a written tradition instead of an oral tradition, as expressed in the dialogue, makes much sense. It is difficult to imagine that Plato gives away all these serious teachings which he presents in connection with the Atlantis story to incredibility and to be ridiculed by presenting them within an invented story, and even lying about the truth status of this story. To these serious teachings belongs also his cosmology in the Timaeus. If all this appeared in close connection with an invented story and a fraudulent story, this really would be strange. So we can doubt that it is an invented story. Now let us talk about the error to consider the Atlantis story a myth. This error is widespread among both Atlantis skeptics as well as Atlantis supporters. But of course, the Atlantis story is not a myth. Because if the Atlantis story is an invention, then it is an invention and not a myth. Furthermore, the Atlantis story is not presented as a myth, but as a true story. So it even is not an artificial myth. And if the Atlantis story is a true story, then again it is not a myth, but a true story. However you twist or turn the question, the Atlantis story is in any case not a myth. Of course, the Atlantis story contains some mythical elements, but only at its margins, in the way as every Greek city has its founding myth. Also, the foundation of Athens by goddess Athena is, without any doubt, a myth. The city of Athens is nevertheless a real city. It remains the question whether the Atlantis story is a so-called Platonic myth. Well, this depends on your definition of Platonic myth. Unfortunately, there is no exact and unified definition of the concept of a Platonic myth. If you define a Platonic myth as an artificial myth, then, as we have already seen, the Atlantis story is surely not a Platonic myth, because the Atlantis story is not presented as a myth. Yes, yet if you think that a Platonic myth does not necessarily has to be a myth, but can talk about real things too, then you could call the Atlantis story a Platonic myth. Finally, there is a very special sense of the word myth. For example, there is often talk of the mythical sunken Titanic or the mythical Elvis Presley. Of course, the Titanic is not really a myth. You only say so. And yes, In this sense, Atlantis has become a myth over time. Yet this is a modern myth, not a real myth. A typical mistake made by Atlantis supporters is the interpretation of the Phaeton myth at the beginning of the Atlantis story as the story of a meteorite or a comet which fell down onto Earth, resulting in a natural disaster. Yet this interpretation is completely wrong. Phaeton is the son of the sun god, and he mounted the chariot of his father, the sun god. Therefore, Phaeton represents the sun and not a meteorite. In the description of the Egyptian priest given to Solon, the concern is exclusively put on the phenomenon that the sun sometimes is closer, sometimes nearer to the earth. Thereby the sun causes either heat and fire or coldness and rain floods. There is no talk about the impact of a celestial body. The Egyptian priest even explicitly says that the comparison he wants to draw concerns only this part of the Phaeton myth. The fall of Phaeton onto Earth is explicitly excluded. Such a demythologization of the fall of Phaeton would make no sense at all. The sun does not fall onto Earth, and if the sun ever had fallen onto Earth, there would be no Earth anymore. Another big mistake made by Atlantis supporters is to believe in the existence of Atlantis in a literal sense, that is, to believe in all features of Atlantis in their literal meaning as described by Plato. This especially means to believe in a huge island in the Atlantic Ocean, which submerged around 9600 before Christ. But this cannot be true. The exploration of the seafloor has demonstrated that there was no such island. And around 9600 BC, the level of development of civilization, as described in the Atlantis story, was not possible. Besides the fact that it is not possible to hand down a tradition over several thousands of years without writing. You have to believe in a very large conspiracy theory concerning many fields of science if you really want to believe in Atlantis in a literal sense. This idea you can put right out of your mind. So many Atlantis supporters fail to understand this. It is really a pity. But if the literal description of Atlantis cannot be true, doesn't this mean that it must be a fiction? That it must be an invention? No, it does not mean this. At this crucial point of thought about Atlantis, many Atlantis skeptics are failing to understand correctly what's going on. These Atlantis skeptics just try to go the easy way by saying that Atlantis existed either in a literal sense or not at all. But you cannot argue like this. Now, how can Atlantis be nevertheless real? The point is, everybody who is familiar with ancient texts is used to the fact that ancient texts often do not match with reality. The reason is not that these texts were invented. Also serious texts are concerned. The ancient texts do not match with reality just because in former times there were many misconceptions about reality. It was not known in former times, for example, how old the world is, where mankind came from, how big the continents are, etc., etc. And in addition to that, the transfer of information from time to time, from civilization to civilization, was hampered by various perceptions of reality. This all resulted in misunderstandings and mistakes, and the transferred information became distorted. What we have today in Plato's dialogues, if Atlantis is not an invention, is a distorted depiction of the real Atlantis. In order to understand how Atlantis really looked like, we have to understand the misconceptions of the ancients, of Plato, of Solon, of the Egyptian priest, and of those Egyptians who wrote down the initial Atlantis story in the time of Atlantis. Then we will be able to decipher the distortions. What we describe here is known as the famous historical critical method. Basically, it is about realizing that human beings thought differently in former times, and that they relied on other premises than we modern human beings do. So it is no rocket science, and it is also no hocus pocus, but simply reasonable. So let us, for example, imagine the typical views of Greeks and Egyptians in the time of classical Greece. There we find, for example, that they all believed that Egypt is 11,000 years old and even older. Of course, this belief is wrong. The history of Egypt starts only around 3000 BC. But this is what they believed in their time. It was a collective error of this time. We find these errors in the works of Herodotus and in Plato's works, not only in the Atlantis story, but also in the dialogue The Laws. Or we find it in the works of Diodor and later of Manetho and in many other ancient authors. So, if in these times all and everybody thought that Egypt is 11,000 years old, then the 9,000 years of the Atlantis story do not stand out. What is more, the Atlantis story is said to have come exactly from this Egypt, which was considered to be 11,000 years old. This means that the 9,000 years simply complied to what you could expect from an Egyptian story. The 9,000 years were nothing unusual. Many Atlantis skeptics believe that the 9,000 years alone would demonstrate that Atlantis must be an invention. But this is nonsense, of course. With this line of argument, you also could declare the works of Herodotus and all Egypt to be an invention, because Herodotus believed Egypt to be 11,000 years old and even older. Also, this is wrong. But also this is wrong, Egypt nevertheless does exist. It was just a misconception, a typical error of the time, and not an invention. This is the difference. It was an error which has to be distorted. Thus, if the 11,000 years of Herodotus correspond to the true beginning of Egypt around 3000 BC, then the 9,000 years from Atlantis logically have to correspond to a point in time after 3000 BC. Atlantis, if it was not an invention, existed somewhere after the foundation of Egypt in 3000 BC. And this sounds quite realistic. In the same way, all other elements of the Atlantis story have to be analyzed. And then we will see whether we find good explanations for everything. Explanations which are not arbitrarily made, but correspond to the notions of the ancient times. And we will see whether the undistorted version of the Atlantis story leads us to a real place, which corresponds to the undistorted information. Atlantis skeptics often make the mistake that they consider each and every deviation from the literal description of Plato's Atlantis as purely arbitrary. Yet this is wrong. Somebody who wants to explain the mistakes of former times in the context of the misconceptions of former times does not act arbitrarily. To the contrary, it is highly reasonable. It is highly scientifical too. The historical critical method is the opposite of pseudoscience. Somebody who wants to declare Atlantis an invention only because of the 9,000 years acts like a pseudoscientist. Yes, it is quite strange when certain academics on the one hand side interpret the age of Egypt of 10,000 years mentioned in Plato's dialogue The Laws as what Plato really thought in his time, because this was a common mistake in his time. And when the very same academics on the other hand side interpret the 9,000 years from Plato's Atlantis story without further ado as an invention by Plato, well, this is not good work, not good scientific work anymore. This is too simply thought. Another good example for a historical distortion are the triremes mentioned by Plato. This type of ship had been invented only shortly before Plato's times. Therefore, it is absolutely impossible that there were triremes in Atlantis. Atlantis skeptics quickly drew the conclusion that it must be an invention and nothing else. Yet, in the works of other Greek authors we find that the word trireme was used also in cases where it wasn't a trireme. The word trireme was simply used to describe any kind of battleship. Therefore, we can assume the same for Plato's Atlantis story. And again, just another argument of the Atlantis skeptics vanished into thin air. As a last example, we want to talk about the well-known Pillars of Hercules. It is clear that for Solon and Plato, these Pillars of Hercules were located at Gibraltar. Yet we have to realize that Solon and Plato are only the end of an Egyptian chain of tradition, and that the phrase Pillars of Hercules is a Greek phrase. In the Egyptian Atlantis story, this phrase was surely not contained. Indeed, the Egyptian priest talks to Solon about, quote, the straits which are by you called the Pillars of Hercules. Quote end. In the Egyptian original text, there must have been used another description which made Solon and the priest think of Gibraltar. There could have been, for example, the straits at the western end of the world. But where had the western end of the world been? When the Egyptians wrote down the Atlantis story in the time of Atlantis, the more you go back in time, the narrower the geographical horizon was. The peoples in the eastern Mediterranean discovered their wider environments only stepwise. One thing can be said for sure. In the time of Atlantis, Gibraltar was not known, because whenever Atlantis existed, It was a very long time before Solon. It was a time when nobody knew Gibraltar. So we can conclude it must have been another Straits and not Gibraltar. At the end of this video, I want to express my conviction that we already know the civilization of Atlantis. It must be one of the known civilizations of the Mediterranean region. And this civilization cannot have been too insignificant, otherwise it would have not stirred up much troubles. We only have not realized yet that it is Atlantis. We only lack the crucial clue, which gives clear evidence to link Plato's Atlantis story with one of the known civilizations. Dear ladies and gentlemen, with these considerations, I want to say goodbye. Please have a look at my other videos, in which I clarify many widespread mistakes concerning the history of Atlantis hypothesis. I hope I could help you to make progress with your own thoughts about Plato's Atlantis.